It is generally accepted that the Second World War began on the 3rd of September 1939, after Nazi Germany had invaded Poland. But the exact causes of war are the subject of much debate. Contributing factors included ongoing conflicts in Ethiopia, Spain and China, and the rise in political tensions in Europe after the Great War, as a consequence of the conditions set out in the Treaty of Versailles. The threat of war was ever present throughout the 1930s, and the United Kingdom had been making preparations to ensure that we were able to defend ourselves and our allies. Scotland and Perthshire were no exception, and the pupils and staff of Perth Academy were heavily involved in these preparations, with many of them volunteering for home defence duties, as well as on land, at sea and in the air. By the end of the war, 79 former pupils of our school had given their lives in the service of their country, and they are remembered with honour on the school memorial. While researching the lives of our fallen, the Perth Academy Remembers project team made contact with a great many people who have made a contribution to this film. One of these people is Alison Glennie, and here she explains her family connection with Perth Academy and how she came to be involved with our project.
My name is Alison Campsie Glennie. It's a Scottish name, but my accent is Canadian. My parents emigrated from Scotland to Canada in the 1950s. I was born and lived in Toronto until the mid-80s, when my husband and I moved to London for his job. My parents remained in Toronto for the rest of their lives, where my sister still lives. You will see and hear her talk about our father's experience in another section of the project. I have a strong connection with Perth Academy. Both my grandparents attended, also my grandmother's younger brother, and two of my grandfather's younger sisters. One of the sisters returned to teach at the school. But I only found out about this when the Flowers of the Forest project was commemorating the 100th anniversary of the dates on which former students had lost their lives. My great-uncle Jack, my grandmother's younger brother, was one of them. He was killed in October 1917 in German East Africa, now Tanzania, where he is buried. This all happened more than 60 years before I was born. I became more personally involved with the Flowers of the Forest in October 2017, when my daughter and I travelled up to Perth and met my two Scottish cousins, Dave Dykes, and the teachers and students at the school who were working on that project. We had a little ceremony of remembrance for Great Uncle Jack at the school. I returned to Perth a couple of years ago for the final presentation of the project. The last former student to die during the First War was Captain James Patterson. It was in March 1919, some months after the war ended, so perhaps from illness or injuries sustained in conflict. The sad footnote to his story is the death of his own son during the Second World War. My daughter Alex and I placed the Perth Academy corsage for Captain Patterson in March 2019 at his gravestone in Highgate Cemetery in North London. It was a beautiful spring day, and the moment was memorable for both Alex and me. I found each experience of laying a poppy next to a gravestone or a memorial plaque meaningful and emotional, not just because of the important family connection to the school, but also because so many young men, most of them younger than my son, gave their lives. I'm delighted to be involved in this second project by placing poppy corsages and name cards of thanks from Perth Academy at the stones and memorials of those who gave and lost everything. I have left 2 at the Tower Bridge Memorial in London, 1 at the Commonwealth War Graves in Margate on the coast of Kent, 5 at the Runnymede Commonwealth Memorial, and on Commonwealth Day too, where I had the great pleasure of meeting Megan Maltby, who is part of this project. The pandemic interrupted the project for some months, but it continues now with renewed enthusiasm. I've been honoured to be a tiny part of this experience and look forward to seeing the finished product on which you've all worked so hard.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received. and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
James Reed Carr was known to his family as Jimmy, and he was born on the 2nd of March 1920 at 26 Tannadice Street, Dundee. His nephew, Bill Carr, shared the story of Jimmy and his family while sitting beside the River Tay at Stanley Mills, a spot very familiar to the Carr family.
Jimmy was my uncle, and he was one of 8 children of Willie and Bella Carr, who lived in Stanley. And this is a good place to be recording this because Jimmy's dad, my grandfather, was the foreman electrician here at the mill. And Jimmy would have known this mill well. He was born in Dundee, but the family moved here in the early 1920s. And Bella, who was Jimmy's mother, took to Stanley very well. It suited her after Dundee, and it suited Willie, his dad, as well. And Jimmy would have spent 15 years, 14 years of his life here in Stanley, and would have known just where I'm sitting now, and would have known the village well. And so Jimmy, at the age of 16, went to sea as an apprentice, and he went to sea in a ship called the Baron Blythewood, which was one of about 30 ships that the Hogarth line had. And he was at sea for about a year before the ship he was on was torpedoed. He really took to the Merchant Navy. It was what he wanted to do, as far as I know from what the family said afterwards. And my dad, Jimmy's elder brother, he too, given the choice, would have liked to have gone to sea. He would tell me when he was younger how his dad would take him down to the docks, to the power station where he was working, and he would see these white ships that had brought raw jute from mostly India, from the West Bengal, from the Calcutta area, and he would look at these ships and he would want to go to sea. And apparently it was the same with Jimmy. He wanted to go to sea. He wanted to see something of the world. So he signed up, as I said, as an apprentice, a deck officer apprentice. And when the war came, he was 2 years into his apprenticeship. And when his ship was torpedoed, he was in the final year of his apprenticeship. He would have been a deck officer at the end of his time. So he was aboard the Baron Blythewood, sailing from Halifax to the UK. I think it was into Liverpool. And the convoy that he was sailing, HX-72, out of Halifax, was attacked by a U-boat. And in fact, it was the U-99, commanded by a well-known German submarine commander called Otto Kretschmer. And the Baron Blythewood was torpedoed and sank in the North Atlantic. And at that time, no one knew what had happened. My grandmother, Bella, had a telegram telling her that the ship was overdue, and in due course, another telegram telling her that Jimmy was missing. And as time went by, it was assumed that the ship was lost and Jimmy was lost. And in fact, no one knew what happened to Jimmy until after the war, till about 1947-48. It might have been slightly later, when Kretschmer, who had commanded the U-boat and survived the war, he wrote his autobiography, a book called The Golden Horseshoe, because that was the symbol he had painted on the conning tower of his U-boat. And my father read this book for no reason other than he was interested. And in there was a description of the sinking of the Baron Blythewood. And the ship was carrying iron ore from North America back to the UK. And it was torpedoed and it sank in, I think it was 8 or 10 seconds. It was the quickest sinking that the U-boat crew had ever witnessed, and there was only one survivor. The U-boat surfaced, U-99 surfaced, they picked up one survivor, and it was only because of that that they knew the name of the ship that had been torpedoed, and they knew the cargo. And the other crew were lost. And as I said, it was only in the late 1940s when this book was published that people in the family knew what had happened to Jimmy. Up until then, Jimmy's mother had been convinced that Jimmy was still alive.
Many of the pupils at Perth Academy had joined the Air Cadet scheme during the 1930s and had undergone some flight training at Scone Aerodrome. To provide sufficient pilots and aircrew for the war that was to be fought in the air, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was inaugurated to provide initial and advanced training in Canada and the USA, and many of our former pupils benefited from this scheme. Philippa Campsey's father trained in Canada and then became a flying instructor. Philippa has shared some details of the scheme and the part it played in helping to win the war.
At the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, the leaders of the Allies realized that the Air Force was going to be crucial to success, and that meant a need for trained pilots, navigators, and other aircrew, thousands and thousands of them. Canada made sense as a place to train those people. It was only a few days away from the UK by boat. It was not in the theatre of war. It had a lot of space. And best of all, it already had a lot of trained flyers. For example, there were bush pilots who flew into the Canadian North to bring people and supplies to remote communities. There were also crop dusters, who were pilots who flew over farms and released fertilizer or insecticides by air. There were even barnstormers, stunt pilots who used to entertain people at fairs and exhibitions in the 1920s and 1930s. Groups of them were known as flying circuses, which is where that term comes from. These people, along with some First World War Air Force veterans and flyers from the United States, were recruited to train pilots and instructors at more than 100 locations across Canada, mostly in Ontario, Quebec, and the Prairie provinces. The prairies were ideal for training pilots. They were flat, the skies were usually clear, and there wasn't much to bump into other than the grain elevators along the railway line. During the war, about 300,000 men and women were trained as aircrew, ground crew, and flight instructors in Canada. One was my father. He joined the Royal Air Force by chance. He had enlisted in the Army in 1940, but they didn't call him up. So in 1941, he went to the recruiting office in Oxford after he'd finished his first year of university studies. He'd given up on the Army, so he went into the Navy office. But the recruiting officer there was away for a few days. So he walked into the Air Force office and they said, "Great, sign here, get your medical there and have an interview." Within a few days, he was in. He did his classroom training in Scarborough in Yorkshire. He finally got to fly an actual plane in Carlisle. You had to complete a solo flight to prove that you had a certain level of skill before you were sent abroad for further training. That was usually in Canada, but it might be South Africa, where there were also several training schools. In 1942, Dad was sent in a troop ship across the Atlantic and put on a train to Assiniboia, Saskatchewan. When he arrived, the aerodrome was still under construction. But the barracks were more comfortable than the ones in the UK, and there was lots of food. Mind you, the prairie winter came as a shock, particularly since the aircraft themselves didn't have much in the way of heating. Dad got his wings in December 1942. He was 21. He did very well in his courses, and that sealed his fate. When the list of postings went up, the first 30 names were automatically set aside to stay on for one more year as pilot instructors in Canada. The rest went back to the UK for active service. Dad did a bit more training to get familiar with a range of different aircraft and was first posted as an instructor to De Winton, Alberta, which is where Ian Graham Campbell Miller from Perth Academy did some of his training. But after a couple of weeks, Dad was sent back to Assiniboia because of a need for more instructors there. He served as an instructor for 1 year. Courses lasted 8 weeks. He had 4 trainees in each course, and so over the year he would have trained at least 24 other pilots. When the year was up, he went back to the UK. While he was waiting for a posting, he heard that the Navy needed pilots for the Fleet Air Arm, so he and some of his buddies transferred. He had to learn new skills like landing on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The planes were called Seafires, which is a modified version of a Spitfire for use by the Navy. He joined a squadron stationed at Arbroath. Most of the Fleet Air Arm bases were in Scotland. By this time it was August 1945. The squadron was going to go out to East Asia, but just as they were on the troop carrier in the Clyde, news came that the war in the Pacific was over. So the ship turned around and went back to port and everyone disembarked. By September, Dad was back at Oxford University. My father's experience was unusual because of that extra year in Canada. The pilots from Perth Academy, whose names are on the War Memorial, would have stayed in Canada for only a few months. First at an elementary flying training school, where they learned the basics of flying, including instrument flying, night flying, low-level flying, and how to recover from a spin. Many of the instructors at that level were civilians. After graduating, the pilots went on to a service flying training school, and these were staffed by military instructors. Some were trained in the special skills of fighter pilots. Others learned to fly the heavier aircraft used for bombers or transport planes. There were also special schools for navigation, wireless operation, bombing and gunnery, and flight engineering. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was, as its founders had hoped, crucial to the Allied victory. If you are ever in Canada, there is a museum devoted to its history in Brandon, Manitoba.
In March 2022, we visited Perth Cemetery to pay our respects to some of the Second World War casualties who are commemorated there.
Prior to the Second World War, the British and Polish governments had drawn up an agreement for military and naval cooperation. After the fall of France in the summer of 1940, men of the Polish armed forces who had been fighting in Europe were formed in the United Kingdom, predominantly in Scotland, going on to make a significant contribution to the war effort. There was a genuine fear that Germany would launch an invasion of Scotland, and by 1941 Polish troops were responsible for preceding the eastern seaboard, and by 1942 a Polish reconnaissance battalion had been established in Perth. By March 1944, it was estimated that almost 200,000 Polish servicemen were fighting in Europe alongside their British allies. The Polish plot in Perth is maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and contains the graves of 381 Polish casualties. Here are the stories of 2 of them.
Father Karol Byk was born on 4th of January 1887 in the Opole region of Silesia in southwest Poland, the son of a farmer. He had been a parish priest in Poland since his ordination in 1913. In 1940, Karol managed to reach France from Poland, where he joined the Polish army as a chaplain. In the summer of 1940, from amongst the Polish units evacuated from France, a battalion in the name of the 14th Lancers Regiment was formed in Scotland. He became its regimental chaplain with the rank of captain. In the summer of 1941, the unit was moved to Perthshire with its headquarters in the village of Newtile. In his free time, Karol enjoyed walking in the countryside, which reminded him of his home in Poland. On the 28th August 1941, he went out walking, but was found dead the following morning near the village. He was 54 years old. In a double tragedy for the regiment, a 21-year-old cadet officer, Gannochy Trust, was also from Silesia, who assisted the chaplain at Mass, was killed in a motorcycle accident on the 30th of August. The whole regiment was deeply affected by this double loss, and the 2 men are buried in adjoining graves here in Jeanfield and Wellshill Cemetery.
Helen Ann Taylor Grassie was known to her family as Nicky. She was educated at Perth Academy, and having lost her life in a rail crash in 1945, her body was brought home for burial in Perth Cemetery.
Nick Grassie's father, James Taylor Grassie, served in the Great War with the Black Watch Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. Grassie left the army in 1926 and took up a position as games master at Perth Academy. James Grassie's daughter, Nicky, joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1942 and was returning from leave on the 30th of September 1945 when she was killed in the Bourne End rail disaster in Hertfordshire. A Perth man, a passenger on Saturday's 8:20 p.m. express train from Perth to Houston, which crashed at Bourne End, Hertfordshire on Sunday, returned to the city on Monday morning. He told a graphic story of the disaster. The train was proceeding as normally, he said, when, without warning, a terrific noise from cracking wood gave the first indication that something was amiss. He was in the rear part of the train, and the occupants of the coach were flung out as the train lurched forward before coming to a sudden stop. With others, he was knocked unconscious for a moment or two. When he regained his senses and looked along the line, he found that the front coaches were piled up high above the engine. He told of how dozens of people scrambled out of the wrecked coaches, of the heroic rescue of many unfortunate passengers who were unable to escape unaided. He paid particularly high tribute to the untiring efforts of members of the women's services who were aboard the train to minister the injured. Police were quickly on the scene, and soon doctors and nurses from a wide area rushed to the embankment to render first aid. The casualty list includes 8 people from Perth and Perthshire, all members of the services who were killed and 20 injured. In all, 43 people lost their lives in this disaster.
Robert Henry Campbell lost his life in Singapore, and having no grave but the sea, he is commemorated on the Plymouth Naval Memorial. He is also commemorated on the family headstone in Perth Cemetery.
Hi, I'm Liam Craig. I play with St Johnstone Football Club, and I'm delighted to be part of Perth Academy's former pupil memorial project. The gentleman pictured here is Robert Campbell, one of the most significant figures in the history of the club. He was a key figure in the early years of the club, and no one did more to help develop St Johnstone in those early years. As well as serving Saints as director and chairman, he was also president of the Scottish FA. However, it is Robert's son, Robert Henry Campbell, who is the gentleman that has been researched by the Academy pupils and who we commemorate here. A former Academy pupil, he worked for the GA in Perth and served in the Merchant Navy for a number of years. On 13th February 1942, Robert was aboard the Royal Naval Patrol vessel when it was bombed by a Japanese warship and sank 2 days later. Robert was missing and later presumed killed in action. Robert is commemorated on the Plymouth Naval Memorial in Devon. Robert, we think of you now and thank you for your service.
Robert Henry Campbell was born in Perth in 1904 and was educated at Perth Academy. He worked for General Accident in Perth before joining the Merchant Navy. Robert had been a rubber planter in Malaya for about 15 years when Japanese War broke out. He was a member of the Malaya Naval Reserve and volunteered to serve on the HMS Gayang B to evacuate 300 civilian refugees after the fall of Singapore in 1942. Robert was reported missing as a result of action with the Japanese Navy on the 13th of February 1942. The Gayang B was bombed and suffered damage during the day of the 13th of February, and in the evening, after a long standoff with the Japanese destroyer, she was shelled and sunk in the Banka Strait. There had never been enough lifeboats for those on board, and 2 of them had been seriously damaged on the day of the bombing. Due to board, and 2 of them had been seriously damaged by the day of the bombing. Due to this and the speed at which the ship sank, a large number of lives were lost. Whilst there appears to have initially been an attempt by the Japanese to handle and surrender of the ship in somewhat civilized manner, they shelled the ship and made no attempt to jettison flotation devices or to stop and pick up survivors, even though they had full knowledge that the ship had contained civilians.
The famous Perth writer and poet William Souter was educated at Perth Academy and is buried in Perth Cemetery, just a few yards away from another former pupil of Perth Academy, who lost his wife in World War II, James Cameron Campbell. William Souter wrote a poem called Patriotism about his beloved Perth and Craigie Hill. We are very grateful to Kevin Scotland and Ish Wade for reading the poem and helping us to remember two of our own.
When I hiked up to Craigie Hill and look at east and west, in all the world said I to mysel, my ain shire is the best. When I hiked up to Craigie Hill and frae the hicht looked doon, there is nae place, said I to mysel, mair braw nor our borough toon. And I be mysel on Craigie Hill, I spak in the Lord's ear. O whan the Haley bugles trill, let me woken up richt here.
Douglas Dunn was born at Rosefield Farm, Balbeggie, in 1921 to Andrew and Jeanie Dunn. He had an older brother, Andrew, and a younger sister, Violet. In March 2022, we met Jill Black, Douglas's niece, Margaret MacArthur, whose mother and aunt were land girls at the farm during the Second World War, and Elizabeth Miller, whose family bought the farm from the Dunn family in 1969.
This is a Land Army doll I dressed for my mother. My mother and her sister, who were the Tate girls from Perth, came to Rosefield as land girls. Auntie Betty had been a land girl already for the Robs at Broxden. She'd hurt her back. The doctor advised her to take an easier job, so she came to a dairy farm. Mum came out with her to Rosefield to be interviewed, and Mrs. Dunn was so desperate for help, she said to my mother, "Would you come too?" So my mother thought for about a minute and said yes. Went in to work at the GA the following day and put in her notice. They both spoke very fondly of the time here. They enjoyed it, or they worked very hard. They got up at 3 o'clock in the morning because Britain was on double summertime. Auntie Betty's lighter job involved hefting huge milk cans onto a pickup to deliver to Scone Aerodrome, among other things. When they first came, Mum said they were still hand milking in a very dingy old byre, but it was all renewed while they were here. They got milking machines, which made life much simpler. And in spite of the hard work, they had very fond memories of their time as land girls.
Well, I was very fortunate to know both some of the Dunn family and having met the land girls, the two land girls, at some young farmers' dinner dance reunions. In 1943, Perth Young Farmers Club started off, and Andrew Dunn was one of the first members, and in fact became chairman in 1944. He would be of a similar age to my father, so I knew some of his children, as in Norman Dunn and your cousin. I was in Perth Young Farmers Club too, and at some of the dinner dances, the 70th anniversary and the ones before that, I was met in with the two ladies we've just been discussing, and they were delighted to know someone from Rosefield Farm, and they were very full of their stories, and a lovely pair of lively ladies. And I'm looking at the doll here, and the Land Army girls didn't really get involved too much in recognition after the war, but in recent times, maybe 10 years ago or so, there was a collection made to recognise these people, and there is a monument up at Cullen in Aberdeenshire. I was lucky enough to go up at the opening, and it's like a farm gate with ladies, land girls, sitting on it, waving and being very cheerful.
Eventually, they were both in the same care home in Blairgowrie, and that was when they got their certificate and their official badge. And it was the owner of the care home, who was very proud of them both, felt that there should have been some more official recognition, perhaps from the council or the badge has been presented by the Lord Lieutenant or some sort of tea party, which they would have loved, but it just came through the post.
When Douglas died, Granny received a lot of lovely letters, and one of them was from a cousin of Douglas's from Ayrshire, who had grown up with Douglas's ages with him, and he regularly had holidays with him in Rosefield Farm. And when he heard the news about Douglas's death, he was serving with the RAF in Wales. So he said, "My dearest Aunt G, Vi and Andrew, a letter from Mother brought me the sad news of Douglas this morning, and within my memory I have never felt such a deep sense of personal loss. I grew up with Douglas and enjoyed his confidences, and I never hoped to meet a finer boy or man. I had always expected him to lead a very full and a very useful life, and it is with great sorrow and dismay that I find it is to be otherwise. Douglas would be awfully ashamed to cause you sadness or suffering of any kind, so please do try to bear your burden as lightly as you may. He always considered that his highest honour and greatest privilege was to have a life to offer at a time like this in defence of the truly fine folks and friends with which he was blessed. Having laid it down now, I am sure he is at peace. All my family offer their deepest sympathy. Please accept mine too. Yours most sincerely, Arthur."
Elizabeth took us to a secluded spot on the farm, and all we could hear was the song of the skylarks. Then the strangest thing happened. Jill had brought the 1932 edition of the Academy School magazine, The Young Barbarian, with her, and in it was a poem written by Helen Douglas, Douglas Dunn's cousin. Helen had written it when she was a first-year pupil at the Academy. The title of the poem is, of course, The Skylark.
The Skylark by Helen Douglas. Spring will soon be here again, and little birds to cheer with their happy voices that are so sweet and clear. The lark, it is a lovely bird, and soars up very high, and renders thrilling music away up in the sky. When she needs to build her nest, it's never in a tree, for on the ground she looks for grass the longest she can see. She lays her eggs to hatch her young. She sits both night and day. The male brings food, the young grow up, and so they fly away.
William Laidlaw was born in Perth 1914 and was educated at Perth Academy. A very talented golfer in his youth, winning the Perth City Championship, he went on to make his mark in the wider amateur field, and on leaving school, he took up his first professional post as an assistant to Gordon Lockhart at the famous Gleneagles Hotel courses.
Following his time at Gleneagles, it was time for Willie to move on, and in 1934 he moved to Malden Golf Club in Surrey, where he played in the English county professional tournament circuit. His skill brought him to the attention of national selectors. With great ability and a shy, quiet disposition, Willie impressed, but he wanted to compete at the highest level. He qualified for the 1937 Open Championship held at Carnoustie, where he demonstrated skill, and with his inbred knowledge of Scottish courses did very well. He didn't disappoint and came 7th in an international field against the world's best, including some of the most legendary American golfers of the day. The winner at Carnoustie was one Henry Cotton. It was Cotton's second win, and he became a national celebrity. He was impressed with Willie, and he came to Cotton's attention such that he became his assistant at his home course in Ashridge, Hertfordshire. Willie joined Cotton on the fledgling European Tour, where Cotton won the Czechoslovak Open and Willie came second. Willie won the 1938 National Assistants Championship in Blackpool by a massive 9 shots. Clean cut and a moral professional, he was recommended to West Herts and joined the club as a full-time professional in 1939. His 2-year contract enabled him time to play the professional tournaments too. A former member, now passed on, remembered Willie, and he became his first pupil. That member appears on the West Herts Honours boards numerous times. Willie partnered Cotton in Red Cross fundraising matches, including one at West Herts, which is commemorated with a picture that we have hanging in the hallway to this day. Of Willie Laidlaw, the great Henry Cotton wrote and spoke of him in a letter which he sent in the late 1980s. Bill Laidlaw was a nice fellow and a very good golfer. He was a tall, wiry chap with a lovely swing, and he hit the ball a mile. He was much better golfer than his results indicated, impressive though he was. I'm sure had he lived, he would have made golf history.
Hello there, welcome to West Herts Golf Club. I'm John Coulter, the General Manager here, and I'd like to introduce you to our club captain, Mr. Larry McGowan.
Thanks, John. West Herts Golf Club are very proud of our history, and William Laidlaw plays a part in that, as our 6th full-time professional employed at the club in 1939. He's pictured here playing an exhibition match with Henry Cotton and Wimbledon's Bill Cox. Sadly, in 1940, William was called up, but was tragically killed in the first bombing mission over enemy territory. A sad end to a man who was destined to become one of professional golf's greats. West Herts will always remember and honour him. I'm now going to place a poppy in memory of Willie, and it's come from the Perth Academy. It says, in grateful memory of a former pupil of Perth Academy, William Laidlaw, died 20th of October 1941. Well done, Willie.
In May 2022, Alice Glennie visited the memorial at Golders Green Crematorium in London to pay her respects to John Campbell on behalf of Perth Academy. On the 22nd of July 1943, John Campbell, aged 20, lost his life in an aircraft accident at Suffolk. He was flying in a short Stirling bomber which took off to carry out practice circuits and landings. An attempt was made to practice a 3-engine approach and the aircraft overshot the runway. On trying to go round again, the aircraft stalled. All on board were killed.
Today I'm laying the final poppy of the ones that I was given to commemorate lives lost in the First World War. I'm at Golders Green Crematorium on a beautiful May day, and I am laying the poppy for John Archibald Campbell, whose name is there, who died on the 22nd of July. 1943, he was in the RAF, and my father was in the RAF. We came up on the train to West Hampstead and walked a distance, and on the way up through West Hampstead, we passed Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and her husband. She was involved in a war of a different kind, a war of diplomacy and so on, but it did make me think that it was perhaps something that was meant to happen today and a link to much of what we've all been doing. So I'm going to put this poppy here now below the panel where his name is. We shall remember them.
On the night of the 20th of July 1944, 26 Hellfire bombers of 578 Squadron took off from Burn, East Yorkshire, to attack the German synthetic oil refinery at Bottrop in the Rhine Valley. 4 aircraft were shot down, but 2 managed to return. Within a few minutes of flying time of Burn, they collided in midair and crashed to earth at Balcombe with the loss of all the crew, including Bill Davidson. In April 2022, we met Dorothy Garvey at Bill's grave in Perth Cemetery, and she shared the memories of Bill which had been passed down by the family.
So, we're here at Perth Cemetery with Dorothy Garvey, who is a relative of Bill Davidson. And Dorothy is a former pupil of our school, and she's also a former teacher at Methven Primary School. So she'll be well known to many people at Perth Academy. And she's just going to tell us a little bit about Bill Davidson.
Bill was a cousin of my mother. She was brought up by his mother and father. He was the youngest of 4, the much loved son. He went to Perth Academy till he was 18, and I'm told that he and the other older pupils had to do fire watching on the roof of Perth Academy. When he left Perth Academy, he went to work in the Army Records down at the old Perth Academy at the North End for a short time before he left to go to train as a pilot. He went across to Canada to train. He was the son of a very quiet family, and my brother can remember the day that the letter arrived, and my mum just packed up and went over to my granny to be with her. It was the silence and the whispers that he remembers. It was lovely that the village, Balcombe, built them with the RAF, built the memorial. That's really special, and it was very kind of them. They were very proud when he got, my mother told me, they were very proud when he got his pilot's wings. It was lovely that the memorial that was there for the 14 people who died that night in Balcombe.
Colin Lorne MacDonald grew up in the manse at Logierait, Perthshire, where his father was the minister. He lost his life in Ethiopia in 1941. We met his nephew Angus MacDonald at Logierait, where he shared some memories of Colin and his family.
Hello, my name's Angus MacDonald. I'm the nephew of Colin Lorne MacDonald, who was killed on the 1st of April 1941 in Ethiopia. Colin was raised here, this building behind me. He was the fourth son of Colin MacDonald, who was minister at Logierait here in Highland, Perthshire, for 33 years, from 1913 to 1946. Colin, the youngest of the four boys that were raised here, including my father, was described by virtually everyone that came across him as just being the loveliest guy out. And I've read lots of letters about him, nary a criticism, just extolling his virtues. He left from the primary school here and went to Perth Academy, and thereafter he went to George Watson's College, and then he went to Edinburgh University, and I suspect he was probably the first Scottish graduate to be accepted into the Sudan civil service. The colonial service was a very elite service that was recruiting almost exclusively from Oxford and Cambridge graduates, but Colin actually got in. The ratio of entry to success was 25 interviews for every person accepted, but I think he pulled a few strings through a cocoon of lost connection that his father had established in the First War. This is where Colin was brought up. This is his homeland, and I'll tell you the story of his death, but I visited his grave in 2016, and I have to say, number one, I was very impressed by the Commonwealth War Graves and how they had maintained this cemetery that had 230 plus British dead in it. But the contrast between the African sun and this beautifully kept garden with what I knew to be this beautiful environment that was so similar. He seemed so far away, and to know that none of his brothers or his father or his grandfather would be able to visit him and know everything that happened to him. But I do know that at 4 o'clock, having scouted with Hugh Bousted the previous evening, this was the third night attack that he had taken part in, and the tactic that they used was they got as close as possible to the Italian defensive positions, and then they lobbed what they called bombs, but we know as Mills grenades, hand grenades, into the trenches and defensive fortifications. So basically they got as close as they could, lobbed the grenades, and then would retire. So this was, they'd scouted the position, and it was near Deborah Marcus, which was the key defensive position. There were very well armed Italian defences, and he went out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon from this particular hill location that he was at, leading 2 platoons of native troops. He was an Arabic speaker, and during the night, which was a pretty wet and miserable night, he came across an Italian position that they had not seen during the scouting that had taken part, and they took it out. They threw their bombs, their hand grenades, and took that out. But I assume that must have alerted the rest of the Italian defences around this place called Gilgit. So he advanced as he had been instructed to do on this much more formidable Italian defensive position, and got to 10 yards and started the attack, throwing the hand grenades. And he was shot through the temple shortly thereafter. The conditions were pretty horrendous. There was pelting with rain, but he had his number 2 was a British veteran of the First War, and he carried Colin's body away from the scene of the attack, and he was buried in this hill ground where he had left. And one of his fellow officers thought so highly of Colin that he carved out a gravestone and painted it black, and travelled the 9 miles to where he was buried to place it. Subsequently, after the war, of course, all these locations were consolidated on Addis Ababa, which was the Commonwealth site that I saw Colin. My dad always said that Colin was the best of them. There were 4 brothers that served in the war and gave service to what was then the British Empire. And I'm only sorry that I never got to meet him.
The Air Force's memorial at Runnymede commemorates by names over 25,000 men and women of the Air Forces who were lost during operations from bases in the United Kingdom and Northern and Western Europe, and who have no known grave. Their memorial was unveiled by the Queen on the 17th of October 1953. In March 2022, Alison Glennie met Megan Maltby of the Commonwealth Graves Commission, and they paid their respects at the memorial to 5 former pupils of Perth Academy.
Sergeant Derek Simpson, Perthshire Advertiser, 10th of May 1941, Pilot's Tribute. He was one of the bravest people I know as an RAF pilot's tribute to a Perth wireless operator and air gunner. Sergeant Derek Simpson was 19 years of age and is presumed to have lost his life on a flight for which he volunteered for. In a matter of urgency, he offered to take the place of another airman who had taken ill.
Sergeant David Hodge. On the night of the 2nd of August 1941, Bomber Command sent 80 bombers to Hamburg, 53 to Berlin, and 50 to Kiel. 11 bombers were lost that night. David Hodge was the second pilot of a Wellington bomber when it was lost over the North Sea and ditched off coast of the Isle of Sylt, Germany. David Hodge was 20 years old.
Sergeant Thomas Nicholson. A short Stirling bomber took off from RAF Chedburg, Suffolk at 23:35 hours on the 22nd of June 1943. The mission was to attack targets at Krefeld, northwest of Dusseldorf, on the River Rhine. The mission was successful, but the RAF and the Royal Canadian Air Force lost 44 planes from a force of 717 aircraft. At 02:30 hours, the short Stirling was presumed to have crashed into the North Sea, 20 kilometres west of the Netherlands. Thomas Nicholson was 23 years of age.
Flight Sergeant Ian Miller. An Avro Lancaster took off from RAF Whitford, Cambridgeshire at 20:27 hours on the 26th of August 1944. They were on an operation to bomb Kiel in northern Germany, a major naval port and shipbuilding centre in the German Reich. A successful raid was carried out, but on the way back from the mission, the Lancaster crashed into the North Sea and the aircraft and crew were never recovered. Ian Miller was 20 years old.
Sergeant James Roy Fenwick, a Wellington bomber of 40 Squadron RAF, took off from Alconbury, Huntingdon, at 4:45 on the 14th of January 1942 for bombing operations against Hamburg, Germany. It was last heard from at 7 minutes to 7 when it sent an SOS reporting engine failure over the North Sea. Searchers failed to locate their aircraft or crew. James Roy Fenwick was 31 years of age. James Roy Fenwick's son, Michael James Roy Fenwick, shared his father's story with us at Scone Aerodrome.
Well, my name's Michael, but my father, James Roy Fenwick, he lived quite close to the aerodrome here, and so he obviously decided when they were called up to join the Royal Air Force. He was with Bomber Command in number 40 Squadron based down in England. Unfortunately, he lost his life on 19 January 42 on a raid on Hamburg, which had a Wellington bomber, and it failed to return, as did a huge amount actually in those days. The Wellington was superseded by the Lancaster, which was a more up-to-date aircraft and was more reliable. The Wellington was the first phase that he was flying, had two engines, but if one went, the chances are the plane would come down. And unfortunately, we believe that's what happened.
David Lang was a talented footballer and played for St Johnstone in the 1930s. The St Johnstone manager, Callum Davidson, laid a tribute to David at McDermott Park.
June 2020 was the 26th anniversary of the D-Day landings, and because of the COVID lockdown, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission offered to leave tributes at the graves of those who had lost their lives in Normandy. As a result of this, we were contacted by Alison Southern, who lives in Southampton. Here's what she said.
I too recently requested a marker for Sergeant David Lang, so I was interested to see your post via the Wall of Remembrance. Our connection is via my 89-year-old mother, who has recently passed away, who was aged 14 in 1944. Living in Southampton, she told us the story of local people being asked to give board and lodging to the pre-D-Day troops. A young man of 30 years of age stayed with our family. His name was Sergeant David Lang from Scotland, and he was with 4 Commando. My mother remembered that he slept all day and would go off with his face camouflaged on night manoeuvres. All too soon he was gone, and my mother's family never saw or heard from him again. Only in very recent years we were able to do some research on the internet. We found out that, sadly, he was killed in action on the 10th of June 1944, just 4 days after D-Day, and is buried in Ranville Military Cemetery. We have visited his grave. It is such a very sad story, but it will always be remembered by our family. My mother had such a lot of memories of that period. Southampton had so much going on for the D-Day preparations. It is quite incredible that just laying that Commonwealth War Graves Commission tribute has connected me to Perth Academy. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the photo of your tribute to the same person.
Sandy Robertson was born on 19th February 1916 at 289 High Street, Perth, the son of Alexander Robertson, a postman, and Rachel Robertson. After the Japanese invasion of the Malay Peninsula, Singapore fell on 15th February 1942, and Alexander Robertson was one of 80,000 British, Indian and Australian troops taken prisoner and imprisoned in Changi Prison. Eventually, Sandy was set to work on the Burma-Siam Railway, and although there are no records of his time there, we know that he died in an air attack at Tamakan Bridge, the bridge on the River Kwai, on the 29th of November 1944. He was originally buried in Tamakan Cemetery before being reinterred in Kanchanaburi War Cemetery. In March 2022, Joe Sharples and his wife were visiting the cemetery, and via Twitter, they very kindly offered to lay a floral tribute and pay their respects to Sandy on behalf of the school.
We are honoured to have been able to add 3 names to our Second World War Roll of Honour and held a ceremony at the school memorial to dedicate a plaque inscribed with the names of John Dixon of Perth, James Victor Gardner of Lunkerty and William James Young of Cooperangus.
John Dixon was educated at Perth Academy, and after many years of service in the Merchant Navy, he attained the rank of captain and was appointed as the harbour master at Hong Kong. He lost his life in an explosion during the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong on the 12th of December 1941, after volunteering to tow an ammunition barge to safety as a member of the crew of the tug Jeannette. Having no grave but the sea, he is commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in the Civilian Book of the Dead in Westminster Abbey. At the time of his death, John Dixon was 39 years of age. After leaving Perth Academy, James Victor Gardner was studying in London when war broke out. He volunteered for service, and after a year with the South Wales Borderers, he trained as a pilot with the Royal Air Force. Along with the rest of his crew, he was killed in a training accident south of Oxford on the 9th of March 1942 when flying a Vickers Wellington bomber. His body was brought home and he is buried in Kirkhill Cemetery, Lunkerty. At the time of his death, James Gardner was 23 years of age. William James Young was educated at Cooperangus Public School and Perth Academy. He was a member of the Air Training Corps in Cooperangus and trained as a pilot in Canada. On the night of the 12th of August 1944, 8 aircraft took off on a mission to attack Brunswick, west of Hanover, including a Handley Page Halifax piloted by William Young. William and his crew failed to return from the operation. The cause of loss and the crash site could not be established. Having no known grave, William Young is commemorated on the Runnymede Memorial in Surrey. At the time of his death, he was 22 years of age. As long as we speak their names, they will never be forgotten.
When you go home, tell the mothers and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today.
They shall grow not old.
As we that are left grow old,
age shall not weary them,
nor the years condemn.
At the going down of the sun,
we will remember them.
We will remember them. We will remember them. We will remember them.